All right, so this is edition 1 of my advanced liquid material. Now, this is a liquid material, not just a water material, which means you can use it for pretty much any type of liquid. It'll also work on things other than just planes. So if you wanted to use it on a sphere to make like a blob of liquid or something like that, you can do that as well. Now it has some pretty cool advanced features such as depth-based blur, so it'll actually blur the surface based on depth. It also has distance field-based ripples that will basically show up anywhere it comes in contact with an object that has distance fields enabled. And it also has the ability to adjust different features of the surface based on its different distance to the surface. So it'll do things like flattening out the waves and flattening out the undulation and all that good stuff closer it gets to the surface, as well as adjusting the color based on the distance to the surface as well as the depth. And it also has subsurface scattering and all of that good stuff. Now, this is not an interactive physics-based liquid simulation, but it is a very advanced liquid material. So you can use this for all kinds of different liquid representations in your environment. So I'm going to give you a quick pan through these examples that I have here. So as you can see, this is water A, water B, slightly more blue, more of a green water. Another version of that same water that's using Gerstner offset. We have blood, and then we have acid. Now, once again, these are just examples, all using the same base material with different instances and different variables that you can go in and change. But you can obviously do a lot more than this. These are just examples that I give you to kind of show some of the dynamicism of the material itself. So I'm going to go back to the liquid at the end here. Actually, you know what? Let's do this one here. So as you can see, this one says water D, and it's using Gerstner height. So this is using Gerstner waves, which can be used for both normal information as well as actually offsetting the surface using world position offset. So this one is using it for height as well as normal information. Okay, and this one is the exact same material, but it's not using a height offset. So if I zoom into this one and kind of go level with the surface, you can see there's no offset happening with the waves, but it is undulating up and down. The entire surface is undulating using sine wave. Now if I go over to this one, you can see that the surface is actually offset using world position offset with the Gerstner waves. Okay, and you can adjust all that on the fly. And then if I go over to this one here, the acid, you can see that it also has ripples that show up and they move away from the surface that it's in contact with. This is based on distance field information. And it's doing that anywhere that it hits a surface, so you can see it over here as well. And if I go in and let's say I grab a mesh, let's just grab a sphere in this case. I'll just throw it in here. And I'm just going to scale it down to 0.5. And now you can see that it's also bouncing ripples off of this sphere. And it's dynamic, so as the object moves through it, you can see that it's affecting those the ripples accordingly. Now, another cool thing about this is since the material is completely dynamic, you can also adjust the height of the material or the plane, whatever you apply this to in your world, and it will adjust dynamically. So you can raise and lower the water level, things like that. This could be controlled via sequencer, or if you want to do it through a blueprint or a trigger or something like that, you can do that. Now, another thing to take note of is that the surface itself actually flattens out the normals and adjusts the opacity and refraction and blur and all that stuff based on the depth. So I'm going to show you a better example of that. This acid is obviously very dense, but if I go back over here to, let's say, this water surface, yeah, let's use this one. Actually, let's use the one that's using height, which is this one over here. So, as you can see, the height of the surface is being offset based on those Gerstner waves, as I mentioned before. But if I grab this plane that it's applied to, and I slide it down, I'm going to hold Shift so the camera stays in position with it, kind of get it where you can see the height here, and I slide it down, you can see that the surface adjusts and flattens out the more shallow it becomes, which is a little bit more realistic. The less depth you have, obviously, the more or the less motion that you have in the volume of the water, right? So as it moves up and down, it's going to flatten out. Now, another thing this does is it also flattens out, as I mentioned, the refraction and the blur. So you'll see the refraction that's going on here as it lowers down. You'll see that refraction becomes minimized. It also reduces the refraction as it gets closer to a surface, even if it's a shoreline or something like that. So you can see in the very center at the darkest point, it's got the most refraction, and this is all adjustable. And as you get to the shoreline right here, where you can see the ripples coming off it. You can see the refraction is completely faded out. And once again, you can adjust this to get the level of intensity that you want for that. All right, so let's take a look at what the actual material instance looks like. So I'm going to load up this material instance here. I'm just going to close the preview window and we'll preview it in the scene. And I'll just bring this over here. So as you can see, all the parameter groups are easily organized in a specific order. So we have textures, we have color and surface, we have subsurface and depth, we have refraction and blur, and then undulation, waves, and ripples. And these all control, obviously, exactly what they're labeled as. So if I start with textures, this is just going to be our normal maps. So we do have normal maps controlling some of the detailed wave information on the surface. We basically have two normal maps here that are two different normal maps moving in different directions. It gives it that nice liquid look. We also have a detail texture. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be treated as a detail texture, but it is being used like that in this case. This is basically a third normal map that you can use on the surface. All right, and then if I go in here, you also have the ability to adjust the color and the surface values, such as metallic, specular, and all that. So if I go in and adjust the shallow color, for example, you can see how that affects the surface. This is obviously the shallower part of the water. And you can really just go in and adjust that however you like. You can also adjust the deep color value, so the deeper part of the material, obviously, or the deeper part of the surface where it intersects with objects. You also have the ability to adjust the metallic value if you want to do that. For example, if you want to make a pool of liquid silver or something like that, you could do that. You can also adjust the specularity. So if you see here, you can see the specular value on the surface, and as I adjust that, it's going to go up and down. Default is going to be at full 1 for this material. And then you also have the ability to adjust your overall roughness. So you can make the water as shiny or as rough as you like. Going in here, we have the subsurface and depth value. So you can control the actual depth of the surface, how far down you want it to actually be for the blur effect, essentially. You can also control the fall off of the depth. And this just gives you a lot more easy art direction and control over your surface. You can also control the overall surface fade distance. So this is essentially the distance from the surface to the surface it's intersecting with. And this will control things like the fade out of the refraction and the flattening of the normals and all that good stuff that I mentioned earlier. And you can see as I adjust that, how it affects the surface. So go back to the default value of 20. You also have the surface fade softness. So you have the distance and you have the softness, which is essentially going to be a threshold for that. So you can go in and control that as you like. You also have the shallow and deep subsurface color. Now this is really going to be more noticeable when you have more direct lights on the surface because it is a subsurface value, but it's essentially picking up light and scattering it throughout the surface, and you have one for the shallow and deep color values. Okay. You also have your shallow and deep subsurface intensity. So if I bump this up quite a bit, you can kind of see what that looks like. And once again, this is more noticeable with more direct light. So if I threw like a point light in there or something like that, it'd be more noticeable. You also have the ability to control your refraction and your blur values. So you have refraction near, so that's basically the near to the surface that you get. So a refraction value of 1 is actually going to be the default no refraction value. So if I start doing negative values, you can see how that refraction shows up on the sides here a little bit more. And since I have those ripples, you can kind of see what that looks like. And if I go above 1, say 1.5, it's going to do the same thing, but in the opposite direction, right? So 1 is going to be no refraction. Okay. And then refraction inner. So I'm essentially using a Fresnel value for the refraction. So basically what this means is as the surface angle changes based on your view to it, so basically the view angle to the surface, it's going to refract more. So basically as the waves stick up and stuff like that, they're going to refract more than they would on the flatter part of the surface that's facing more direct to the camera. This just makes the refraction a little bit more realistic because the denser the surface that you're looking for, the more refraction you're going to get. So if I go in and adjust that and kind of see how that looks. Okay. I'll set those back to the default values. You also have the refraction Fresnel. So this is essentially the amount of fade-off distance that you have for that Fresnel effect as it wraps around the surface. You also have your blur intensity. So the blur intensity is going to control just that, how much of a blur value you get based on the depth. So if I set this to a higher value, let's say 0.3, and I go in here and adjust my shallow blur amount and deep blur amount, you can see how that affects it, right? And I can bump up my shallow blur amount as well. Okay, so I'm going to set all those back to the default values. And then down here you have a lot of options to control your undulation, waves, and ripples. So undulation is going to be the entire body of water undulating up and down, right? So you see the ripples that are going on, or the Gerstner waves are going on here. So I'm going to disable those for a second. And if you look at the surface itself, I'm going to bump up the undulation height here a little bit just so you can see a little more intense. I'm going to bump up the speed. Okay, so you can see essentially what it's doing, right? It's undulating the surface. Now what you'll notice here is that the undulation effect is very minimal as it gets closer to a surface. And this is obviously by design. And once again, if I throw this sphere in here and scale it down to, let's say, 0.5, it's going to be affected by anything that it comes in contact with, right? So as I move this sphere up and down, it's going to do the same thing. There's obviously an exaggerated effect. I bumped up the speed and the height value and all that stuff. But there's another thing that gets flattened out because once again, the shallower the water, the less motion it will usually have. And without doing a full physics calculation, this just gives you a decent representation of what that would look like. But with that, I'm going to bump this up again, actually. You can also adjust the overall undulation scale if you want. So if you want like a smaller undulation, you can do that. Default value is 1500, which is fairly accurate for most decent sized bodies of water. And then you also have the undulation near height. So this is basically the height as it comes to the surface. So I set this to 0. There's essentially no undulation where it hits the surface. If I set it to a higher value, let's say I set it to 20, then the whole surface is just going to be undulating as the rest of it would be. So these are all the default values, which seem to work pretty well for most use cases. And then down here, you have the ability to use Gerstner waves for either the normal or the height value. So if it is set to true, it's going to be just normal information, which you can see here. So I'm going to bump that up to 1 so you can kind of see what that looks like. And as I scale that down, you'll see the effect it has on the surface. Okay, let's set it back to 0.3. So if I uncheck this, then you also get height values from that Gerstner information. And you can keep it with the normals as well. If you want to completely disable the normal value for it, you can just set that to 0. So now we're also getting the offset of the surface using those Gerstner waves. And then you can go in and obviously control the amount of waves that you have, all of that good stuff. You can control the overall Gerstner wave scale as well. And you can control the speed of those Gerstner waves. Another thing you can do is actually control the direction of those Gerstner waves. So this is going to be XY. And then you have the wave steepness, which you can also control. Essentially going to control how steep and sharp those waves are. And then you also have the near height value and the far height value. Once again, this is the value as it gets away from a surface as to how high those Gerstner waves go. This is using a similar technique to what I'm doing for the undulation, but obviously on a different scale, and I have them crossing each other rather than just having one moving across. And then you also have the wave count for your second large Gerstner waves. So you'll see here that I have a first large Gerstner and a second large Gerstner. So these are basically intersecting with each other, and you can control them independently. And then I've got a medium Gerstner 1 and 2 as well. These are basically going to be smaller versions of that same Gerstner wave setup. You can control those separately. And you also have the normal wave intensity. So if I go in and let's say I disable the Gerstner waves completely, right now it's only using the normal information for the waves that you see on the surface. And I can go and control the intensity of that normal map. So I want to take those out completely. So normal wave, far intensity 1 and far intensity 2. I can basically get rid of those completely. Now we only have the detail waves on the surface. So if I go in and control the detail wave, far intensity, I can get rid of all the waves completely, right? So this is essentially just controlling the intensity of the normal map on the surface, how much influence that it has. So I'm going to set that back to the default values. I can also go in and obviously control the near intensity and all that good stuff. So let's say I do want the waves to show up from the normal maps to get closer to the surface. I can go in and do that, and you'll see those showing up here as well. And I'll set that back down to 0, and then it'll fade out. So it gives you a lot of control over how your surface looks. And obviously I can go in and control things, just like with the Gerson waves, I can control the speed and direction. So let's say I want to make this a little bit faster. I can do that. So if I want this to be flowing water in a specific direction or the opposite direction, I can use a minus value. Let's say I want it to be on sort of an angle. I can do that too. Okay, set that back to the default value. And then I can also adjust the overall wave tiling if I want. So if I want these to be smaller waves, I can give it a much tighter value, as you can see here. And I can give it a higher value as well if I want. So let's put it back to where it was. And you can do this with all the different wave values in here. Right. And then over here, I've also got my ripple intensity. So you can see the ripples here, and I can control the ripple values here. So the actual distance from the surface that they show up. So if I go in and say I bump up the ripple intensity a bit, and then I adjust the distance that they actually flow, I can control that. I can make them nearer or farther from that surface. I can also control the ripple amount, which will obviously be affected by the distance that they're traveling. I can control the ripple speed, so I want the ripples to move much faster. I can do that as well. Okay. All right. So all of those values are easily controllable, they're easy to art direct, and they're all labeled very clearly. The material and the functions and the instances that are used for this are also labeled very clearly. So if I go into the material instance here, I've essentially got multiple material instances for these different liquids that you see. They're all based off of a single material instance, which is this one here. So this basically allows you to control overall values. Let's say you want to control all of the wave values for all these instances all at once. You can basically just do it from this main instance, which all of these are children of. And then you can go into the main material, which is this main instance as parent or master. As you can see in here, I'm not going to go into all of the functions and everything like that, but as you can see in here, everything is clearly labeled as to what it does and all that stuff. And I essentially have multiple material functions in here that are all being brought together in this master material, so then you can repurpose these in other master materials if you want to, or if you need to make an adjustment for, let's say you want to change the naming for Gerstner waves or anything like that, any of the material instance parameters, you can do that and it'll automatically populate to everything that it's being used for, right? So everything in the material functions and all that is labeled very clearly. And it's also very clearly organized in the material instance, as you saw here. So obviously we have all these independent material instance groups, and everything is sorted in a very specific order in all of these. So all the sort priority is set appropriately, and it's just very easy and straightforward to use. So if I go into this other scene real quick, which is the actual demo map, you can see what this looks like. So this is basically using a directional light, so you kind of see a little bit more what it would look like in an outdoor environment. And once again, you can go and still control all those values that I showed you, and everything is completely dynamic. So I slide this up and down. You can see how it functions within the world, and everything just reacts how you'd expect it to. All right, so that is edition 1 of my advanced liquid material. Hopefully you find this useful and get to see it in some of your work eventually.